Hey everyone, welcome back to Life Unpotted. Today we are joined by our really good friend Ray, and just want to take a moment to recognize that Ray is the co-host of Dualistic Unity, which has been a pivotal podcast and platform and community in both Daisy and I's journey of recognizing that we're not who we think we are, recognizing that the reality that we've been living maybe didn't really reflect the reality we thought we were living. And I had met Ray, I think, probably almost 2 years ago online, and we went to one of his retreats that he co-hosted in Vancouver Island, and I would say it was life-changing. So if anyone is looking to go to a retreat, I know Ray can give us some more information on that, but they have a few coming up, and I just want to say that Ray, Dualistic Unity really was a pivotal experience to our journey. So we wanted to, of course, have you on the podcast. It's been a while, and just wanted to bring you on, chat without pressure, without expectation, and just, seeing where the conversation goes. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So we've definitely been going through it. I mean, it's been interesting. I think Daisy and I have been talking a lot about just the process of continuously deepening your awareness, continuously understanding more and more. And with that comes a lot. With that comes feeling more than maybe you felt before. And for me, I've been experiencing in a level of my body has been hurting a lot recently. And just yesterday, we were just saying that it's almost like sometimes it seems like life was easier when we weren't as aware, right? When we weren't as aware. And it's just interesting to be in this place now where we're going through the shit, feels like every single day. And I know that's something that you can relate to. And given that you're the one that we had first learned all about this from, and I know you always say, well, we learned about it from ourselves, but you, by sharing your openness, sharing your vulnerability, sharing your love, frankly, it really did open up a vehicle for us to see that in ourselves.
I really appreciate that. It's interesting because, and it's been 2 years, roughly 2 years since I met the two of you. And so, wow, what a long journey, right? But we were talking about this on the podcast recently-ish, about the fact that it always seems simpler previously because we didn't have as many considerations to a child. And I know right now you're acting as a nanny right now, Daisy. And so you can see that to them, everything's very simple. I want a cookie. I'm going to go get a cookie. The thought, does anybody else want a cookie, isn't there. And it's because they are very much caught up in the simplicity of their own journey. They're doing what they can based on what they know. All of a sudden, when you add the consideration of somebody else, it doesn't seem as simple. And you may wish to go back to what was simple, but ultimately it was only simple because it was selfish, because it was blind. And so as we become more aware, it's still simple. It's just that we're more aware, right? And so it becomes an entirely different game in terms of how many considerations are we weighing? How much are we being empathetic towards everything else, or how much are we just focused on that cookie? Because that's why it was simple.
Such an interesting point when it comes to just the simplicity of it all is because when you act as a human being, we have this logical mind. And I don't know if when we're children, we just don't have it becoming this giant motorboat that's just constantly moving and moving and moving and moving. But it seems we get to a place in adolescence or adulthood where the mind is going nonstop. And it was just this morning that I was reflecting on acknowledging and having the awareness that I was extremely anxious. And I was sitting down, I was I'm just going to sit with this, I'm going to have a cup of coffee, and I'm just going to write. And as I was going out through that process, it hit me that in order to be relaxed, in order to exit the anxious state, because anxiety is just moment to moment to moment, it's so easy to say, I'm anxious. Today I'm anxious. When in reality, it's each moment we get to reevaluate. Do I want to be anxious in this moment? Because it's all happening in our mind. And as soon as we're able to open the door, walk out of the mind, and not listen to the thoughts, observe the thoughts, and move into our body where the anxiety really is, we can just sit with it. And it's so much more simplistic. It takes us back to that simplicity of just sitting with it. Like our body's so intelligent, it just knows what to do if we can just sit there and not go on our phone, sit there and not go get a bag of cookies, sit there and, just sit with it. So that was a really interesting experience I had. And, going back to the early days of Dualistic Unity, I remember the first time I listened to the first episode of their podcast, just scratching the surface, and my mind was blown. I couldn't comprehend anything. Nothing made sense to me, but I really liked this idea of I'm not what I think I am, but I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend what that meant. But like fast forward 2 years later, 2 retreats later, mushroom trips later, constant daily work later, whatever you want to call it. And I'm able to recognize that, it's not necessarily that you aren't what you think you are. That's true in concept, but it's not a concept. It's a decision and it's an experience that we get to make in every moment. So I just wanted to bring it full circle because the first time I'd ever heard anything like that was through the complexity of Dualistic Unity. So it's been a long journey. And for Ray, I imagine it's been a very long journey for you. The last 2 years have been the past year, because we went on the first retreat that Dualistic Unity ever had back in November of 2022. And it's really hard to comprehend that my life has completely changed in the last year. And that's a facet of reasons, but it's still, we're still processing it and we're still going on Dualistic Unity retreats. And it's just exciting to have Ray here because it did start. And I don't know where to even start this conversation, but I wanted to lay that out there because the last year has been a fascinating time and want our audience to get to know Ray more because that's where this conversation started. So pass it to Ray.
I just want to say I'm inspired by the two of you. I know how hard it was to start a podcast. I know how much you've gone through in terms of just questioning yourself and getting out of your own way and plunging into the unknown. And that's really what it is. I mean, I don't get any credit for any of the progress that you've made. I'm just grateful that I was able to be around while you made that progress. And it's funny because I remember one of our earliest conversations, Daisy, where you had just leveled with me. You're like, okay, I hear what you're saying. What the hell's the point? And I had said, well, just freeing up sensitivity and space and time and allowing yourself to have some more attention for your own life rather than what everybody thinks of you and getting out of the rat race and doing all that. And just from that conversation, just to see just the two of you, you look so relaxed doing this podcast now. And I know how hard it was when you started the podcast because I went through the very same thing. It's like, oh, Jesus, am I saying anything of value? What are we going to do next episode? I don't know. And you don't know. And you just keep going. And that's life in a nutshell. You don't know and you just keep going. And some people are going to pull one thing out of what you're saying and other people are going to pull other things out of what you're saying. And you have no control over that. But to just continue to express yourself authentically. I think that's the best thing anybody can do for anyone. Because at least then you know it's you. You know that if people are responding to you, at least they're responding to you and not what you're trying to be. So no, I'm very excited to be here. And to your audience, hi. It's very nice to meet you. I appreciate it. It has been an incredible 2 years. But the last year of my life especially, so much has happened in the last year since I met you in person at the retreat. It hasn't just been your life. It has felt like a decade has gone past. Like there have been so many changes. But that's the thing is that there's always change. Change is always happening. It's that we get caught up in these stagnant ideas of who we are and what's going on and where we're going. And so every day starts to seem like the day before when every day is in fact incredibly different.
I find that so interesting because the past few days, I have just felt so out of it. And today I was like, I left the apartment and I was like, am I contributing to this? And I was really trying to understand, we talk about it like we always are. Either we're aware of what's happening and we have the ability to further relax into what's happening, or we're thinking about it, we're caught up in our mind thinking about it. And it's just so interesting. And I'm curious to hear Ray's thoughts on this. Like, are we always contributing? Because it was my experience, what was happening the past few days. I was like, my body hurts. I just don't feel good. I feel so tired. I just didn't feel good. And I was like, but this feels different because in the past I've felt good and it didn't bother me as much. Why is it bothering me this so much this time? And it was just making me think, am I caught up in it right now? What is it, me thinking about it? What is it? And I noticed I went out, I went for a drive, met up with a friend this morning, and I definitely felt myself relax a little bit on the walk. And it's like, I get back in the car, I'm like, oh, I'm feeling better. My body kind of still hurts, but I relaxed into it. And it's interesting. I think we go in and out constantly of our ability to relax. And then there's times where it's like, I forgot how to do any of this. But I think what I'm realizing is that's exactly what contributes to it, is thinking it's something we do. It's thinking that relaxing is something we do with the mind. And I think I've been trying to find my answers through the thinking. I've been trying to understand, how can I get out of what I'm feeling? Why am I feeling this way? Until I'm realizing I think that might be the reason why I'm feeling this way.
That is an excellent way of putting it. I like to think of it in terms of my attitude towards my thoughts. Because if I start thinking about my thoughts, then I just end up in more thought, which is a game of control at the end of the day. And with control goes stress and tension, and my body immediately suffers for it. And so I try to remember that I can't think my way out of thinking. And I ultimately don't know what I'm going through. I just know what my opinion of it is. And that's the problem. The opinion of it more than anything else, because whatever I'm feeling is part of a process that I don't know or understand. Like, give you a perfect example. I'm a parent to a teenage daughter, and there are times when she will get kind of edgy and a little bit angry. And from her perspective, she thinks that she's just going through anger, or she thinks she's just being irritable. But I know that she has a homework assignment due the next day, and that it's weighing on her mind behind the scenes, and that it's influencing her responses as such. And so it's not always what we think it is. It's almost never what we think it is. There are numerous different things influencing whatever it is we're feeling at any time, because we're always in process. We're always in flow, right? So we're processing something. You could be processing lessons that you were chewing on when you were 5 years old somewhere in the background, and you wouldn't even know, because you are that limitless in terms of how much you're processing all the time. So that said, though, I think it's interesting, because when we're feeling low and we start thinking about it, I always wonder if we're thinking because we're feeling low, if thinking is not, in fact, a result of feeling low. Because when we're feeling really high energy, when we're really clear, we're not thinking at all. So I wonder if it's the thinking that brings us down, or the being down that brings the thinking.
I can really relate to that, because earlier today, when I was saying I was feeling super anxious, and I said, like what you said, I'm like, oh my God, like, I'm not going to make myself less anxious by thinking about it, because all I'm doing is subliminally thinking about things that are going to happen that I'm not doing, that are in the future. And it's like, well, what is happening in this very moment? Like, can I actually be in this present moment? And you said something right earlier, mentioning that we kind of live in a society that makes us think that each day is going to be the same. But it's actually, each day can be a millennia if we aren't really playing to like the numb that is not feeling. It's feeling the same emotion every day. And, I don't know where we learn this. I don't know if it's just me, or if this is like widely felt with other people, of feeling like we are supposed to be consistent in how we feel every single day. And the more that I chew on that, the more that I sit with that, I realize that it's a gift that we can feel the full spectrum of human emotions. It's a beauty, because really, if you think of our life in a gray scale, if we were feeling the same thing every single day, that kind of sounds like being numb. When, if you think about it, our feelings of what our emotions are don't have to impact the actions like that we take on a day-to-day basis. If we just accept them, if we stop thinking about them, if we stop wondering, well, I'm on Instagram and everyone looks really happy, and why am I sitting here in my room with writing and doing this and doing that? Like, the answers are not in the mind? If the answers aren't in the mind, aren't they just in the present moment? And isn't this present moment infinite in potential of what we can experience? And if that's the case, if we're not here, are we anywhere? Where are we if we're not experiencing this exact moment? I saw someone at the park the other day. They were screaming, they were yelling, and I thought they were on the phone, but they were just screaming that they're about their kid, they're screaming about their life. And it always reminds me of a book where I was reading where that's what we all are doing. Unless we are in the present moment, that is what we're doing in a day-to-day experience. We are screaming, we are commenting, we're like the person going into a baseball game with the clicker we're counting the people who are going in, we're counting it, we're counting their thoughts, we're counting our thoughts. Is that a good thought? That is a bad thought. Like it's infinite, it's endless. And we can put all of that behind us only if we can really stay in the moment. And I think going into the body is something that really is a clear line of, okay, I'm not in the mind anymore. Where am I going to go if I'm not in the mind? Well, I guess I go into the body. I observe the thoughts. All of this to be said, I just think that it's an interesting place to be when you are aware of these thoughts constantly, because it can be a superpower where you're able to recognize I'm free. But on the teetering side of that, you got to feel all the shit. You got to feel everything. But on the other side of that is if you feel everything, it's not going to last that long because you're constantly ever changing. So I don't know. I think that this conversation is infinite in that way. It has we are all here, so we have any direction that we can go in. But here I am wondering what should be the next thing I say. What should that be? When in reality, it doesn't really matter. No one else is thinking about that the way that I'm thinking about that. And it just makes me think back to the first time I started joining the community Zooms with Dualistic Unity, where I would be so terrified. Kind of the thing was you go and you just start talking and you say something and then someone says something back. And that was kind of the first space I'd been in where I talked without thinking. And that's a huge lesson because it makes me wonder, do we really need to plan anything if we can just be present? And that'll be my question to Ray.
Oh, that's a great one for sure. I think it really comes down to the recognition that when you're not thinking about yourself as much, then you're just left as reality. You're just left here and now. But that means you're not disconnected from anything. You know, like the question, what should I say now? Should I keep speaking? Am I talking too much? It would be like if one of our neurons was trying to act on its own for the entirety of the brain. It's like, no, you got to pass information back and forth. You know, sometimes you can speak, sometimes don't speak. There's no right answer because it's always the interchange of information and energy that's moving around from one person to the other. And I say one person to the other, but it's just through what is. We perceive it as people, but it's really just what is. When you're not thinking about yourself, it's reality. And we just kind of forget that reality is intelligence in the same way that we are intelligence in motion. We perceive separation between us, so all of a sudden we don't impact one another. But of course we do, right? Of course we're always impacting one another. And so I find it really interesting because when you get out of the way, and this is why we think, this is why we get lost in thought, is because it's really unsatisfying. The alternative is to just live your life and make ripples and not know where those ripples go, not know where you're going. And so the only focus that you have is whether or not to be authentic and relaxed or to panic and be in control. And that is the entirety of it. And so the entire spectrum of thought and doubt and all of that is control. It's just, if I'm not thinking about my life, I'm left with it. And if I'm in my life and I don't like how it feels, if I have preferences and opinions, more importantly, if I'm making preferences and opinions based on assumptions, then I'm never actually in reality. And that's it. It's just, I don't like how this feels. I don't see where it's going. I don't feel like I'm more valuable. I'm pretty sure somebody's doing better than me. So I'm going to think about it. All right. And the alternative is just moving forward. And that's super unsatisfying until you get into it. And then you recognize that that was the basis for play. That was the basis for enthusiasm, was just moving forward. And there's no reason that you can't do that in your life, but we forget that just because you're not measuring your progress, that doesn't mean you're not making progress. Just because you're not actively making notes about everything that you're learning from one moment to the other doesn't mean you're not learning from one moment to the other. But we actually think that unless we are, studiously pounding information into our head, we don't take it in. But you are taking in each and every experience you have, more so if you're not thinking about it or thinking about yourself doing it, because then you're actually involved with what you're doing. This is something that anybody who has ever used a hammer will tell you. Pay attention to the nail, not how you're doing. Pay attention to the nail, because if you're worried about your progress, if you're worried about how you're looking with that hammer and nail, you're going to hit your thumb each and every time. And it's that lesson over and over again. Pay attention. The rest takes care of itself.
It makes me think a lot about to what extent what we're feeling is actually uncomfortable. And I take the example just of, I notice, so a few weeks ago or just a week ago, I was feeling a lot of emotions and crying a lot. And it's I wake up the next day and my mind and body have automatically switched back on to, it's Monday, let's work. And then I notice what comes after that is this level of gray cloud that feels like something's wrong. I just don't feel good anymore. I just feel something's off. And then there I am, I almost forget of all the things that I'm processing. I almost forget all the things that I'm constantly going through. And it just makes me think about, to what extent, should we always be feeling? Is the base state that we should be in, should we constantly be feeling? Because I see myself going from feeling, which I guess what I've seen is an intense feeling of pain and darkness, and I'm in that. And I almost don't know how to find that middle ground of either I'm in the pain, I'm feeling it, I'm healing it, and then I come out of it and I'm in this place that feels uncomfortable because I think I know there's still stuff going on, but I stopped paying attention to it. And it's what is that? What is that? How do we, when we're processing so much shit and going through so much shit, how do we maintain a sense of feeling like we're feeling? But, to someone who says, well, I don't want to feel like I have to stay on the couch all day and feel the sadness and feel all the emotions. What do I do when I'm going through such intense emotions? How do I bring that into my day-to-day life? Because if I don't keep paying attention to it, all of a sudden I'm angry and I'm paying so much attention to how perfect I'm being and the work I have to do. And all of a sudden I'm completely distracted from it and I'm caught up in doing everything I can to not feel it. And in a way, I think we constantly go from feeling to trying to not feel. And I guess, I don't know, for me, the thing I've been thinking about recently is finding that base state of never closing, always staying open, always feeling. But I guess I just don't know how to do that because my mind, maybe I'm scared of what it feels like to always feel. It's not something I'm used to at all.
This is a great question. It's funny because it's really not about getting to a place where you're not feeling, because that's where all of our conflict comes from. At the end of the day, that's when we're lashing out. As I was saying earlier, that's where we're being pushed and pulled by influences that we're not necessarily looking at. So it's really important to recognize and to embrace feeling as a whole. I think the danger comes when we assign the feeling a narrative, because then it's not just the feeling. Now it means something about you. And that's where it turns dark. That's where it turns into suffering. As soon as it means something about you. Up until then, it's just a feeling. It's just an emotion. And it will pass. But as soon as it means something about you, about your progress, about whether or not you're getting out of the shit or you're still stuck in it, as soon as there's a narrative assigned, you're fucked, right? Because then it just turns to ash. It all turns to poison as soon as it's about you. But until that point, as long as you recognize that it's not personal, they're just emotions. They're just feelings, right? And they're very much like a spectrum of color. You don't judge one color in the rainbow, because if you were to remove it, the other colors wouldn't exist. Like it's a spectrum that goes from one end to the other. Emotions are the same way. You might not like feeling down or depressed, but if you were to remove Sophie from the equation, that feeling of being depressed and kind of, melancholy would inspire you to get up and do something, inspiring you to learn that you can push past that feeling, that you do have more influence over that feeling than you might think. But as soon as you start thinking about why you're feeling it, you're not doing anything anymore. Now you're stuck in your thoughts. And your thoughts become a prison. Because as long as you're like, there's a problem, there's a problem.
Well, it's interesting because, so for example, like I was feeling a lot of stuff last week of like childhood stuff and feeling all the feelings. And I guess I struggled to strike the balance of, okay, I'm going to feel this stuff. I'm going to process this stuff. Maybe stuff I've never really confronted. Maybe stuff I've never really thought about before. And then all of a sudden I start thinking about it and I start processing it and I start understanding, oh, well, whoa, that happened. And I was feeling like that this whole time. And that's why I've been. And it's like, the reality of it is we'll never know what any of it means. But I did find the level of, in order to feel, it did help to think about what happened. It did help to go back and understand this is how it unfolded. Is there a line where you let yourself go through that and then the dangerous territory comes when the story continues and you think it has something to do with you? I think when, like, personally feeling such intense emotions for the first time, it's hard sometimes to say, well, that's not me. I can understand it's not me, but those feelings are still there so intensely from when I did experience it. So what do I do with that? I guess just feel it, but do you reckon what I'm saying?
It's interesting because you're always feeling things. You're not necessarily feeling something from your childhood. You feel something and you assign it a memory or you assign it a reason for coming up, and then you deal with that. That's the problem, is that up until you assign it something, there's nothing to deal with except the feeling. And the feeling itself will pass. But it can become addictive to look for a resolution to suffering. It can become addictive to go through your memories and your feelings thinking that at some point you're going to come to a place where you don't suffer anymore, where that feeling of being down and depressed isn't there. If you can just go through enough memories, if you can just go through enough of your conditioning and your programming, eventually there will be no suffering. And it's always in the spectrum. Always. It will always be in the spectrum. And as long as you look for a reason, you will find one. That is the beauty of your brain, is that it confirms whatever perception you're taking. So if you're suffering and you're like, this is because of my childhood, your brain will back that up. But if you recognize that suffering always comes from a conflict with now, then your problem is not in the past. It's now. It's in your reaction to now. Whether you are tensing up, looking for control, trying to change life as it is to something that you would prefer, or recognizing that you don't know and allowing the change to happen. And I know that's super unsatisfying. This goes back to that idea. It's like, but what's going to happen then? Where will life go? That's the point. You know the opposite. You know where life goes as you're trying to get away from suffering. When you stop trying to get away from suffering, all of a sudden you find that it isn't the scary thing you thought it was. And its tone changes entirely.
That's making a lot of sense. I feel like I've really been comprehending this recently. So I had this analogy once. You know those things when we were a kid, we'd put our finger in them, the resistance bands, and if you pulled really hard, like your finger would get stuck. That is like a metaphor for our brains. And it really is. I had a crazy experience earlier. I'm like, is it like anxiety is rampant in our society? Everyone has anxiety. Everyone is constantly anxious. We are run by anxiety. Our last 2 podcast episodes were about anxiety because we're feeling all of the anxiety. But is there this like huge kept secret that the way to rid of anxiety is to accept that you're feeling that in that experience? Like, is it just to feel what you are feeling? Like, that's why it's like, is that why it's so important to get out of our brain? Because our brain is always going to find a solution. It's always going to have stuff to back that up. It's always going to find something to tell us why we are feeling the way we are. And that's going to further put us in a prison of, you're anxious because this happened to you 18 years ago and that's how you are. That's where you're at right now. And it's like, as opposed to saying, I'm anxious right now. In this moment, I'm going to accept that. And that's the hardest thing to do. You said that your point was very unsatisfying to hear. And it's interesting how we are packaged this idea within the mental health space that we have to heal everything in a particular way. We have to heal everything through giving everything a name. And sure, tools are important to understanding what things are and understanding, of having awareness of things. But those tools are never meant to be the place upon in which we settle. And that can only perpetuate what our mind wants, which is worries to find solutions to. And it's almost like the most unsatisfying thing to ever hear is that in order to live in peace and presence, we have to live in that constant state of accepting that what we feel like right now is shit. But the beauty is that it just goes away and then it comes back and then it goes away and it comes back. And I guess that's what it means to live raw, exposed, is that you feel all the stuff, but it's also madly satisfying to transition through feeling all the shit in a negative way to feeling everything in a beautiful way. That's where the most beautiful works of art come from, is the human condition, and understanding that the human condition is not to be thrown away, to not to be thrown in the garbage, to not be condemned. It's to motivate us and drive us in every moment of every day. Like, we think about this grind culture of finding motivation to make money, make a startup, find something, do this, progress. And we're looking for motivation and over too much caffeine. We're looking for motivation in Adderall. We're looking for motivation in getting up and doing 10 push-ups and then doing 5 pull-ups and having these like meticulous routines that are going to make us able to engage, going to make us able to be motivated. Which, what I'm finding is the greatest motivation is just facing whatever the hell it is you're feeling in every single moment, because that is what alleviates your suffering. It's really hard, but I feel like once you recognize this, there's no going back.
And that right there is responsibility in a nutshell. It's on you. The buck stops here. And that's maturity. The path of maturity is the path of recognizing that it's solely on you how you respond to your life. You can blame other people or not. But I wanted to go back quickly, because if the theme has been anxiety, this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, because I used to suffer from crippling anxiety. It was one of the original health problems that I had as a teenager that really made me wake up to the fact that I was rushing and doing things in a way that wasn't necessarily good for me. We use the word anxiety so often that we actually start to think anxiety is a thing, but anxiety does not exist without the belief that we can be in control. Because that's what anxiety is the loss of control. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so rather than wrestling with anxiety, I would say that we're wrestling with control and forgetting that we've never had control. We've never really known what's going to happen. And we're still here. And recognizing that, all of a sudden the anxiety just fades away. Not because you feel safe, but because you recognize you've never been safe. And the alternative to being safe is being capable, which is what you are.
That's so interesting, because it's like there is a time in life where we do think it's such thing to have control. I think I look back to like how I used to live and going down a very specific path, and you break from that, and you like right now we're living in complete uncertainty, right? And we say that like, oh, that's not something that's new. We're living in uncertainty, but it's like you're always in uncertainty at every given fucking moment ever. And yeah, we're just aware of it now. We just understand it now. And I think that's where so much of the discomfort comes from, is thinking that there's an alternative way to be. There's such a thing of having control. There's such a thing of knowing. And I think it's so interesting, like when you decide to take a path like us three have taken currently in this moment of, you know, starting a podcast and building this shit and literally living on savings. Your mind wants you to think, well, you know, if I had all that money coming in, or if I was at that job, or if I was in that situation, I'd have a little more control. But all it ever is perceived control. There's never such thing as control. And it's a beautiful way to put that anxiety is thinking there's such thing as having control. That resonates a lot. And I really like that. Yeah. I just think that's awesome, because it just helps recognizing like what you're saying too, about recognizing that trying to rid of the suffering, thinking that we're not going to stop our thinking, we're not going to feel these things is exactly what perpetuates and turns a blimp of feeling of I want to control into something like I have generalized anxiety disorder. Because all of a sudden you're labeling it and you're turning it into a classification. Because guess what? It gives you more control that way. Because at least I know I have anxiety. At least I know for sure I have this thing I can then pinpoint. And there goes, the whole conversation of the whole mental health system and the labels and the identities of you have this. And Daisy had a recent therapist experience where a therapist was like telling her, she's like, well, that sounds like a textbook example of depression. And Daisy came home and literally sent her an email. I was like, sorry, I'm no longer continuing. And I'm curious to hear, Daisy, you could tell Ray a little more about that. I'm sure he'll get a kick out of that.
Oh boy. I don't know. It was a very insightful experience to go into a space where my experience was trying to box an experience into an in place of a title of you are this and you are that. And it made it very clear to me that oftentimes is the problem. It always leaves me at this confusing point of trying to understand at what point is a therapist helpful? Because not all therapists are the same. There's so many different types of therapists. But I walked away realizing that just because you are certified in something does not mean that you cannot fuck someone up. And just because you aren't necessarily certified in an idea of something doesn't mean you're definitely going to fuck someone up. There's more perceived risk, but at the end of the day, there's two ways to help people. There's to read by a textbook and say, this is the textbook. And then there's to experience life that you've experienced and just hold that space and just say, yeah, that's an experience. And it's a complicated one, I think. I think it's recognizing that the work is not just done for a period of time, 1 hour a week. It's something that you wake up and you decide to do as soon as you open your eyes. And you do it when you're about to shut your eyes at night. It's something that you never stop doing. So my takeaway again was just that we are constantly, if you want to put it that way, we are constantly in therapy with ourselves. Constantly. Every second of every day. If you are putting it into a verb, it's working through these emotions and feelings and whatever you want to call them. But when it comes down to it, it's the uncertainty. And I do want to say something on that note that I experienced was, so I am nannying right now, and I was putting one of the smaller children to sleep for a nap, and it threw me back to the reminder of, as a small child, complete uncertainty arises when you go to sleep by yourself. I remember that. And I remember as a kid kind of laying there and looking at the stars and starting to question and be fearful of, like, do I exist? Is this happening? What is happening? And you start to fade away. And it's interesting because remember that experience within yourself, you can almost see someone having it when they're afraid to sleep. So it's interesting to really see that kids are the same as us in that way, that they just haven't found concepts or labels or reasons to attribute as to why it's scary to sleep. Like, it's just scary to be alone with your thoughts. And as a kid, you're experiencing things for the very first time. So it can be very amplified in that moment. But it's interesting because as an adult, seeing that, it is validating because that is the truth. And it's easy to walk around and see anything but the truth day to day when you go out of your house, when you go out of your apartment, when you go out of your space. You're bombarded with anything but the truth, with all the distractions.
Well said. Yeah, the one thing I know very well is that going to school to become a counselor or a therapist does not teach one to be self-aware, unfortunately. It does teach one a bunch of theories that unfortunately, you do not have to go and actually apply in order to pass. You just need to be able to pass the tests, and apply them to your clients, not necessarily to yourself. And that is unfortunately the case. One thing that I know, because again, I was married to a therapist for a long time. It's the therapeutic relationship that is the most important thing. It's not even the therapist, really. It's how comfortable are you sitting in that environment so you can work through your stuff. It's not about going and getting a diagnosis, though a lot of therapists think it is. Like, if I just identify the problem, we can make that go away. But other therapists who have been doing it a long time recognize there is no problem to resolve. It's always about your relationship with yourself, which means that it's not necessarily about the emotions that you're feeling, but your attitude or your response to them. It's not like I don't feel depressed every once in a while. It's not like I don't feel all of a sudden like I'm going to judge myself, like I'm doing a terrible job, I'm a bad father, I'm shitty entrepreneur, all of that stuff. It's not like those feelings aren't there. It's that I look at them and go, huh, rather than, oh shit, that's got to mean something about me, and then just tear myself down with it. It's no longer, oh, I'm feeling that, therefore it's the truth. It's, oh, I'm feeling that. And it passes. It's not that I've stopped myself from feeling it. It's that I've recognized that just because I'm feeling it doesn't mean that it has the foundation in reality that I think it does. I just desperately want to explain where it's coming from, and my brain will immediately do that because, as you said, same as when we're kids, we don't know. But now we have all of these concepts. Now we have all of these ideas, these false certainties about what we're experiencing, and it gets in the way of our relationship with the unknown, because that's what all of this comes down to, your relationship with the unknown. Are you going to relax through it, or are you going to panic? And that usually comes down to a perception change, in my opinion, because typically we think of ourselves facing the unknown. And if you think about yourself facing the unknown, that's fucking terrifying, because the unknown seems fucking huge and you seem really small in comparison to this giant unknown. But if you recognize that there is no unknown without you, you are the unknown. You're only ever facing yourself. So your relationship is with you as you change. Why panic?
It's interesting because I think that I didn't understand this until we went to the retreat and took mushrooms. This concept of, whoa, like, what the hell is going on? Who am I? Like, I feel like for the first time ever, I felt like I was like, I love the analogy of like going to different rooms and seeing myself and feeling this complete uncertainty. And I do think back, like I remember being a kid and having nightmares about death and just not wanting to think about it. And it's so interesting when you go to the retreat, it's like you feel like you're home. You feel like, and not because of anything anyone's doing, but it's because we're not doing anything at all. We're just being, and there's a sense of relaxation and peace. And above all, you're not running from anything anymore. You're not running. You recognize like it's okay. And I remember having a moment where like just like I saw Ray, and it's like you didn't even say anything, but it's like you knew. And it was like that moment of validation, that moment of being seen. And in a way, all you're doing is letting yourself see yourself because you've let go of everything you've been holding on to that we don't even realize we're holding on to. And it's interesting how like, it's just so, I think it's so interesting how when we let go of the concepts and the narratives and all this stuff, we do recognize, holy shit, like we are here. And how unbelievable is it that we are here and that we're everything? Like we are existing as everything, and you see yourself in everything, and yet we think we're so small. We think we're so fearful that we can't do things and that we'll never be able to achieve things, and that no, people don't like us. And I think it'd be curious, right, for you to, it'd be interesting, I think, for our listeners to maybe hear, I think the concept of division can be hard to explain a lot because, again, we're talking in concept. A lot of this stuff, when we're talking in concept, it's hard to understand. But when you have experience like through psychedelics, it takes you out and you're able to really experience stuff. So is there a way you typically would explain the idea that we are all one and that we are all connected in a way that someone who's never heard this could maybe try to understand.
So most people are familiar with the yin yang symbol, which shows one side and the other side of reality. But in each of those sides, there's a little bit of the other side as well. And so what they're trying to show in that symbol is that everything in reality, everything that we experience, is a dichotomy. Like it's either darker or lighter, heavier or lighter, warmer or colder. There is the perception of you and me, right? There's anger and there's joy. Like everything that we experience, every single thing is somewhere within this dualistic spectrum of one side versus the other. That is the basis for our experience. Without comparison, there would be no experience. Without there being a here, there could not be a there. And so that's the foundation of our experience. The paradox is nothing is actually separate. That what we're experiencing as separate isn't. That our perception of it is not the reality of it. And that's where the paradox comes in, that we are all one with the perception of having free will and being individual, separate from everything else. It's the reason that the double slit experiment is so interesting to scientists, because what it shows is that without the observer, the observed does not exist. The observed does not know how to act or be without an observer there. So the observer and the observed are the same. We forget, because we're experiencing reality, that we are reality. And it's that simple. As soon as we think about ourselves, we perceive ourselves as separate from everything else, despite that being an impossibility.
So to someone who says, well, I can understand that conceptually, that, maybe we are all connected but can't feel it. What do you think is the reason that it's so hard for us to understand unity, and that, we talk about psychedelics and it's like, okay, well, that we always say it's not the mushrooms, right? It's just you, but something does happen. Is it that the mushrooms, the synapses fire differently, that you are able to process things faster? What allows the realization to happen so much faster than when you're not, when in normal day-to-day life right now? What enables us to experience this realization on that such a deep level?
You stop thinking about yourself. That's the thing about mushrooms. What they do is they basically shut down your default mode. And your default mode are all the things that you habitually think from day to day, all of the false assumptions that you use to basically think that you know who you are, where you're going, what happened, and what people think of you. So all of those thoughts are always happening, giving you some sense of certainty that you know what your life is and who you are within it. And when you do mushrooms, that all disappears. That default network or that default mode just gets pulled away. And so what you're left with is reality. And so the only real difference in recognizing unity versus dwelling on the concept of unity is how self-absorbed you are. The more you're thinking about yourself, the less you can see yourself as part of everything else. And it's that paradox that makes it so very difficult, because people then want to understand more. And in doing so, they want to be in control, and that gets in their way. And so this is why it's always about surrender.
That's so interesting, because it makes me think of being in a room full of people who are thinking about themselves and how it's impossible to genuinely connect. Like, think if you're going to a bar with early 20-somethings who you can kind of look around and see everyone's thinking about, oh, am I dancing wrong? Should I get a drink because they're getting a drink? Like, you can feel it. And I've been in that experience, observing it on the outside, as opposed to being in a room full of people that aren't thinking about themselves at all. Think of a close, it doesn't even matter. It could be any experience at all. It's just a matter of, if no one is thinking about themselves, you're going to feel like that connection. Like, or maybe early on when you are entering into an early relationship, that feeling you get of like love and connection. I really think if you were to put a feeling to understanding that unity exists, it's that you're not thinking about yourself when you're talking to someone, and you feel the love between the two people, and you feel seen, and you feel everything. And like, to me, that feels like the itchiest itch that could ever be scratched, is like that, of like deeply connecting with people who aren't thinking about themselves as you aren't. And I think that's why going on this journey of being able to willing to question, to change your reality, to say, I'm not going to live my life this way and I'm going to be free. And that's going to be challenging in every moment. I'm not going to think about myself as much. I'm going to catch myself when I think about myself. I'm still going to do it, but I'm going to be aware of it. I think that's why it can be so isolating to find people who can mirror back to you what you're bringing, you know, in a way of not thinking about yourself. Like, it's a one-sided experience. Maybe others kind of see that energy and they're like, oh, I don't need to think about myself so much. And those are the ripples. Like, those are the ripples. Everyone is going to go out and take that ripple and put their own spin, their own personality on it. But I think once you experience a feeling, and I think that's why these retreats with Dualistic Unity are so impactful. I swear this isn't a giant ad for Dualistic Unity retreats, but I think they're so impactful because it's no longer concepts. It's all just feeling. It's all not thinking about yourself or thinking about yourself so much and then realizing, fuck, that's why this is so awful right now. It's because I'm thinking about myself. But it's being able to walk away. So if he was like, why do I feel so much relief leaving retreats, even though I'm going through so much shit when I'm at them? And it's because you're connecting with other people who are doing the same thing. And I feel like if people say we need protein, if we need fiber, we need carbs to feel satiated, like we also need like true connection. I think that leaves us feeling alive, like we can do anything. And that's what allows us to think of things for the greater good. That's what allows us to think about other people, to actually make change. And yeah, maybe it is selfishly because you feel happy connecting with other people, but it all comes back to, in this moment, in this experience, like, how are you showing up? Are you thinking about yourself, or are you facing thinking about yourself and saying, it's really uncomfortable that I'm doing this? And it's interesting. It's always just this moment is where all the potential exists.
Well said. Yeah, it's funny. This is the reason that we do karaoke at the retreats, right? Is to very much just get out of the way, because the less you care about judging anyone else, the less you care about judging yourself, the more you are just being yourself. But it's so funny that the feeling of truly just being yourself, of feeling free enough to be yourself authentically, feels very much like what it is to authentically connect with somebody else. It's just as easy. It's just as simple. And it's difficult because when you're practicing these things and you go out into the world and it's not reflected back to you, because you're still meeting people who are trying to be something, people who are trying to prove something, trying to get you to see them a certain way, it's really important to remember that the ripples are still happening. You may not see them, but they're still happening, and you're not separate. So it's not just you. There are others out there making similar ripples. And I say this because for half of my life, I felt like the only one that was out here, just working towards being myself consciously, in terms of just letting go. It felt like it was just me, and that was enough. I actually reconciled. Like, if I never see the impact in my lifetime, that's fine, because I still know it's happening. And now all of a sudden it's coming out of the woodwork. People are having this conversation more and more, and whether they realize it or not, it's all going in this direction. It's all going towards eventually questioning this conceptual self, this need for control, and our arrogance in thinking that we know what the fuck is happening, right? And that's really what it is, because we know what control can do. We understand what thinking is doing. We are living the current fruits of our endeavors. And so this is going to happen of necessity. But I would say that it really just comes down to do it for you. Do it because if nobody else is doing it, at least there's you. And that changes everything. That energy, that attitude towards it is exactly the attitude that makes the most profound ripple, because it's your ripple and you're doing it for you.
Right. I'm curious to hear, like you said so many years ago, you started waking up and having all these realizations. How have you seen your journey in hindsight, looking at it, right? Do you feel like you're going through it and in a way you feel like you've progressed, or do you feel like it's just one giant circle of like you're in that same moment forever? Like, do you feel like your awareness has deepened? And if so, what does that look like? Or are there ever moments where you're like, whoa, it feels like nothing's changed in terms of what you're experiencing?
That's a fantastic question. I would say that nothing has changed in that I'm still aware of how limitless and infinite the inside of my awareness could be, if you want to call it the inside. What's changed over time has been my response to it, how much I thought it was about me personally, like my devotion to the idea of myself within all of that infinite spectrum of things I could think or feel. Now it's just, yep, it's in there. And I don't necessarily tie it to me or my value or my progress. Like I don't think about Ray in terms of how is Ray doing? Because I know there's no answer to that, or rather there's infinite answers to that. Whereas once upon a time, I would have judged myself according to, how much am I judging myself? How much am I trying to let go of control? Am I still holding on to control? And it was just this idea of a narrative, a path, again, towards enlightenment or a cessation of suffering, right? And it was because I could see all of these infinite perspectives, but I was still habitually attached to the perspectives of me. And that's something that I'm still getting over to a large degree, even to this day, when people say things about me like, "Oh, Ray, really appreciate all the stuff you've done." Like it doesn't hit. Like there's a part of me that's just like, okay, that's nice, right? And it's just because of those old habitual perceptions of me. But that's why it is so important to do things for your own reasons, right? Because I will always act the way I do towards everyone else. I will always see them as myself now. And it has nothing to do with whether or not they understand what I'm doing. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's appreciated or recognized at all. And so that took a long time to get. And now I'm just learning to recognize that it's okay if people compliment me. I don't have to get attached to that either. Isn't it funny though? We go through the process of like, oh, I really need compliments. Fuck that. I don't need compliments. Fuck all of you people. Right. And then later on, we're just like, okay, that was kind of nice. I don't have to, get carried away with it and let my head get all huge about it, but I can acknowledge at least that somebody's appreciated something I've done. But it really is that more and more just a deft touch when it comes to how I respond to what I'm experiencing. Just patience and a little bit of clarity and the willingness to just admit that I don't know. Because so much of my conflict, so much of my crap, so much of my suffering just comes down to assumption. It's like, I don't know what's happening. I'm going to assume shit because then I have something to work on. It's like, you could have just sat there. Something would have popped up eventually. Like, don't worry. Life directs you from one moment to another, right? You just have to keep participating and the road will continue on. But we forget that. Like, if I'm not thinking about the road ahead, it's not going to happen. It's like, it's going to happen better than you might think because what you're thinking about is what you've experienced previously, not what you're going to experience next, because you can't think about that. It hasn't happened yet.
That makes me think of my middle school had this sign and it said, "A failure to plan is planning to fail." And the way I always interpreted that was, let's just be super anxious and just think of the future and think of the future and think of the future and think that that's doing something, which you would be better off not planning if you can understand that this moment only lasts right now. And I can never prepare for what's going to happen in this experience. I can't prepare for anything. All I can do is trust myself. And that's where we move out of the thinking mind. That's where we move into existing and something else takes over. And we actually, I think you mentioned earlier, it's where we have play. It's where we have fun. We just experience. And it always takes some sort of hill to climb to get there where you go down and you're in flow and you're having fun. But it's just not cessation of suffering. It's cessation of thoughts, of taking thoughts as factual, of reality. That is where the freedom is. And it's interesting because you can end suffering right now if you want to. And again, that's an unsatisfying answer because it's uncomfortable to say, well, what do I do? What do I do? You have to do it not knowing if what you're doing is right. You have to be able to say, I'm just going to learn to do this. No one else knows how to do it. Anyone else trying to tell me how to do it probably doesn't know how to do it because that's not how you do it. You just surrender to the uncertainty and everything else after that follows. And that becomes more and more clear every single day. In the moments, I think the days feel longer because the moments feel longer because I'm actually in the moments versus worrying about the next moment. Because if you're worrying about the next moment, your head is not over your feet. I don't even know where your head is. Maybe it's ahead of you, but how would you be able to be feeling this experience where your feet are if your head is 6 feet ahead of you? You can spend your entire life like that, not knowing that you're not actually experiencing this moment. And that's why life can feel so hard, is because you're just battling. You're trying to get all of this stuff done, but you're not here. You aren't in this moment. So you're just trying to play catch up, and you're just thinking about the future and the future and the future. And that's where these ideas of being stupid, or these ideas of being slow, all these ideas come from, of thinking that you can't be something. And it always just comes back to, you don't have to listen to your thoughts. And if I knew that when I was 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old, I don't even regret that I didn't know that, because it feels so good knowing that now, that that doesn't even exist anymore. So if you want to say something, I tell you.
I have been thinking, like, our cell, like if you think of like something growing, right? Say you have like cancer or something forming in your body, how much of our own fear and our suffering contributes to these illnesses and to these things we're experiencing. That it's like the idea of like, I have to worry about this, or even the stress I'm worrying. I don't know. I'm just going to put that out there and see if it lands and see what you think.
This is definitely an interesting question, because on the one hand, you don't want to say to yourself that, if you get sick, it's because of what you're thinking, because that's definitely not the case. That's an oversimplistic way of looking at it, because of course, what you're thinking is a drop in the bucket compared to what you're thinking all the time and your overall attitude towards life. And so I would say that it's pretty clear that stress makes it difficult on our body in every way, shape, and form. Stress makes it hard on our immune system. It makes it difficult for us to digest food. It makes it difficult for us to process energy as a whole. Stress really locks up our body. And this is something that I know in terms of cancer treatments. They know this so much that when somebody goes into cancer treatment for the first time, or for the first few months in the early stages, they will work on that person's mentality more than anything else. They will try and keep that person positive, because they understand that if that person is stressed, it's less likely that they will kick that cancer. The body will not work as well in terms of fighting off the cancer or finding equilibrium if the person is stressed out. This is something that they know, not to mention the fact that we have the placebo effect. But that said, we also exist in a world with a lot of other factors contributed to by a lot of other mentalities. There are a lot of stressed out, controlling, fearful mentalities that will cut corners and pollute the environment and do all kinds of stuff that inevitably will come back and affect us to one degree or another. And so I would say that there's no answer. I think that it's important to remember that there is no mind-body disconnect. Like that whole thing of like mind and body doesn't actually exist. They're the same thing. Your mind is your body. Your body is your mind, right? So that said, the best thing that you can do is just relax and trust yourself, trust your body in the same way, because it knows what it's doing. I mean, this is why it's important to remember that when you hurt yourself, you don't have to think about healing. You just have to not get in the way of your healing. And so that's very much the same with everything else. But I think, as above, so below, as much as that's true individually, as much as you will feel better for, relaxing about your current state, not panicking about how you feel, making different choices in terms of how to respond to it. Like, yeah, I still feel like I'm dragging ass, but I'll push myself a little bit, and, that'll remind me that I've got more energy than I do. Like, it really is about that. But if you stress about it, your body's going to continue to reflect that stress. Right now, if you do that throughout your entire life, where you're relaxing more and more and you're embracing, those moments, and even if you're sick, you're still not letting it get to you in terms of mental health and all that stuff, you start affecting everybody else. And our collective health starts to change, which might change our collective priorities as well.
It's interesting because when I think about stress, there's times where I physically know I'm stressing. And I guess if we think about stress and like cortisol and chemicals being released, but when we're thinking, are we stressing? Is thought inherently, and is any fear, thought, or concern inherently linked to stress? Because I think of stress as like when I'm actively really, really worrying, but it's like, does it have to happen on such a macro level? Can it happen even when I'm just sitting here thinking, oh, I don't feel great? Like, even there's like that undertone of fear that maybe I'm not aware of in the moment, but it's still happening. I guess to say it's really easy to be unaware of the way we're treating our bodies and to be unaware of how unrelaxed we are. And it's not until we relax. Like, I remember at the retreat, it was after like I think it was in the Denver retreat. It was like after second night, I was like, holy fucking shit. I have not felt this relaxed in like years. And it's almost like we don't know that we can exist in that state because we've never existed there, or maybe in small pockets, like when you're a kid or you're on summer break or something, and you just know you can let go. So it's interesting to think of how much we are even on a micro level, how we are contributing to, holy shit, just like learning to relax seems to be one of the hardest things, but it just seems to be the answer to everything.
To go back to your question, I would say that it's never the thought that's the problem. We tend to think it is, which is kind of funny in itself. It's our response to the thoughts, right? Like the idea, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe that's why I'm sick. Doesn't mean anything until you take it seriously. As soon as you look at it, you're like, that could hold truth. That's the problem. Up until that, it's just potential. It's just another thought. You're like, huh, that's interesting. Right? And it's funny because we do that all the time. We do it all the time. It's just like we have thoughts that go by all the time. Like if I was to say, you are the best driver in the world, you would go, that's ridiculous. And you would disregard it. And it's that easy to disregard a thought. And we do it all the time. But if it's a thought we're afraid of, way harder to disregard it. All of a sudden we look at it like maybe it's true. And that's what fucks with us. Maybe it's true.
That's a really simple way of putting it. Like we're going to deflect a thought or a compliment. If we're someone who can't receive compliments, we say, no, that definitely can't be true. But it's so interesting because it's so hard to say no to like the habitual cycle of thinking that we are a particular way that we've thought that for our entire lives. It's like becomes a pattern. It's so hard to say no to that. But just because it's hard doesn't mean you can't do it. It's
because we're scared. Like it's like it just goes back to we're scared of something. Like if someone's like the way he just said, like if someone's like, "Oh, you look like a llama," you would be like, "Whatever, that doesn't impact me." But if someone's like, "Oh, you look like you," I don't know, like if something's happening or like you think someone's judging you, it's like all of a sudden, that could be true. And it's like that the only difference in those two things is how much concern we have if it were to be true. Because it's like, okay, if it was to be true, why does it have any different bearing than if, the other case scenario? So it's so interesting to think it's ultimately comes back to, are we scared? And how much are we giving weight to the fear and not just realizing that the fear that we're having is not proportionate to the reality itself and what actually we can experience when we recognize that the fear doesn't reflect any truth, just like the thought doesn't reflect any truth. It's just how willing are we to find out that it isn't true.
Well, we wonder why it's so difficult of what we're going through, of every moment taking our knife, cutting down this forest that keeps growing back and keeps growing back and keeps growing back. And each moment, the way we face ourselves is by taking our knife and cutting the piece and cutting the trail and cutting it to make a trail again. Like it's constant. We're constantly doing it. And you wonder why. It's because we have all of these ideas of ourselves that are so difficult to say, oh, I'm not going to take that as fact. And these things are happening every second of every day of every moment. So no wonder it's difficult, but worthwhile to question every thought that we have. And yes, it is exhausting physically. You question, why am I so tired all the time? Because you were doing a lot of work within your internal environment that no one else can see, but it's 100% impacting how you're experiencing the world. And it's interesting because no one else really sees that until they do, and they see you as a new person. And they're like, how'd that happen? And you start to see like everyone else loosens up a little bit. Everyone else relaxes a little bit because you're here doing all this work that no one can see, but everyone can feel. I think that's it. And that's the ripple. That is 100% the ripple. And again, because just because you're experiencing it, it's the same as when you're alone and when you're with people, you're just doing it. And you may not feel anyone else letting up. You may feel them letting up, but they're still being impacted by that experience. The awareness level, maybe they're just thinking that, oh, this is a good time. But if you dig a little deeper, it's like, well, what allows this person to be in this place? Ray, it's been amazing having you on the podcast today. This conversation, I'm very excited to edit this episode. I'm looking forward to listening to it because there's a lot of stuff said here today. And it's interesting. I always know an episode is great when I have no idea what we talked about because I wasn't thinking about what we were talking about. I was just experiencing it moment to moment. And that's the goal. I feel relaxed. Like that's always the goal of these conversations, is to just enjoy. And I think having him on a Saturday is interesting. It's like sometimes, we're so used to doing things that a Saturday can be a day where it's like, well, what do I do? Maybe you do nothing. But having this engaging conversation, it definitely took me into the moment and took me into flow. So I appreciate your time being here, Ray.
As always, I just appreciate the conversation with both of you. It's always enlightening, and it always is a great exercise in just, working out the kinks. Because that's really all we're doing when we get into a conversation. We go into it, we're like, oh, what am I going to think about? And those are the kinks. That's the stuff that's in the way. So, oh, what am I going to do? Where's this going to go? And then by the end of the conversation, you're like, that was ridiculous. It just flows on its own. And that's life. Life is exactly the same way. You don't have to be thinking about what you're going to do the next 2 weeks. You'll work it out. That doesn't mean don't have some vague idea of the direction you're going in, but never get caught up in thinking that you need it to happen that way or that it will absolutely happen that way. And you'll always adapt. But this has been a blast. I'm looking forward to seeing the two of you at the upcoming California mini retreat. That's going to be a lot of fun. And of course, we're going to have you back on the podcast soon. We're going into season 6 now. This has been a lot of fun. And back to what you were saying, it really is just about jumping in and seeing what comes out, because that's when you're trusting all of the growth that you've already gone through. You're not trying to control the conversation. You're allowing yourself to be the conversation. So it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel so much more relaxed. I think it's interesting. I remember you saying like Dualistic Unity is like the last step. It's the last place you go to in a conversation. I feel like I've been kind of teeter-tottering somewhere between that of like, why am I feeling this way? And then it's like, oh, right. You don't have to ask that. You can just exist. And I think there's something about just talking and having this conversation and relaxing and remembering. It's constantly remembering that we can always relax a little more. We don't have to worry, and things will unfold so beautifully. And right, if you want to let our listeners know about any upcoming retreats, where they can find you guys, anything to know about Dualistic Unity, do the plug.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can check out Dualistic Unity on any podcast platform. We've got a website, dualisticunity.com. We have a mini retreat coming up in Virginia Beach on February 1st to 5th. And then we have a mini retreat coming up in California near Big Bear Lake. That'll be April 11th. And then we are probably doing another one in June in Colorado, probably returning to our Cushcation location that we went to last time. And then we're doing a camping trip coming up in August. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. So we're doing a lot of stuff because, as you said, it really is about the conversation, and more, it's about the state of mind that's driving the conversation. It's not about the words. It's never about the words. It's always about you being yourself. And that comes through the words and through everything else. And so again, this has been a blast. I appreciate the opportunity to do the plug. And I just want to thank the listener for joining us and listening to me ramble. It's always a lot of fun to join you too.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for listening. It's been a blast to have Ray, and definitely check out Dualistic Unity because, as we said, it's been super impactful on our journey, even though, we'll give Ray that compliment and he can take it. I know he's working on that, but thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to everybody on Thursday.